Hi folks, Matt here from the Ask the Arb podcast, and today I just want to talk you through something that is really important for those of us that not only work in the ecological and arboricultural sector, but also nature conservation in the wild in the UK. There's a lot going on at the moment. I've already talked on the podcast about the planning and infrastructure bill and the impact that that's likely to have on the sector, and particularly on protected species in the UK and how they are looked after. So I'm going to ring my bell. I told you I was going to totally and utterly abuse this bell button. I've had a few comments on that one, but anyway, what I want to talk about today is essentially the planning and infrastructure bill and the impact assessment that was carried out and came out yesterday. Yesterday being the 6th of May. So, yeah, we need to talk about the planning and infrastructure bill. Not the headline promises about speeding up house building, not the scripted sound bites about efficiency and streamlined assessments, but we actually need to talk about what's quietly being dismantled, the legal and professional basis for species level protection in the English planning system. The result? A bill dressed as reform, but driven by deregulation, not in name, but actually in practice. And species protection is first on the chopping blocks. So think bats, newts, etc. There's a narrative in the media at the moment that protected species are a blocker to development, and it's just not the case. We work with a lot of developers right across the UK, and most of them are stand-up citizens that want to do the best they possibly can whilst driving their business forwards and having a commercially profitable enterprise. And the reality is that if the survey effort is done and protected species are considered early enough in the development process, they're not a blocker to development at all. What is a blocker to development is years and years of successive governments promising the world and massively under-delivering, under-resourced local planning authorities, and an under-resourced private sector as well, actually. To be honest, we've got a real recruitment problem in the sector. So my article, which you can find on LinkedIn, I'll link it in the description, basically breaks this down to a number of headings. So first off, let's talk about the policy vision. They talk about faster and simpler, and I mean the language of the impact assessment itself is telling. Throughout the document, when I read through it, environmental safeguards are portrayed as not as essential tools for balancing development with conservation, but as delays, complexities, and duplicative requirements. Page after page of the PDF makes it clear that the goal is to create a planning system that requires less evidence, not better evidence. The implication is that if we just stop asking awkward ecological questions, we'll get more houses built, and that's just not the case. And here's the problem. Wildlife doesn't disappear because you stop looking for it. What does vanish is your ability to prove it was there and your legal and ethical obligations to mitigate harm. In terms of the mitigation hierarchy, which has underpinned everything that we've done in ecological consultancy for decades, there's no meaningful reference to the mitigation hierarchy in the impact assessment at all. For ecologists, this is not a technical omission, it's a wholesale rejection of the structured framework that essentially underpins everything that we do within responsible planning. And for those of you not familiar, the mitigation hierarchy is pretty damn simple, to be honest. It essentially says that first we should avoid harm wherever possible, we should mitigate if harm is unavoidable, and we should compensate as the actual last resort. And from what I can see, the planning and infrastructure bill jumps us right to compensation. And, you know, this isn't just best practice. It's a foundational policy that's embedded across UK guidance, the licensing frameworks, and even judicial precedent. And yet the impact assessment chooses not to mention this at all. I don't believe it's an oversight. It's a deliberate shift in emphasis from ecological duty to development expediency. And is it actually going to speed up the planning process and get more houses built? I don't believe it will. At the end of the day, species surveys are not optional. They're evidence-based, and there's a damaging narrative being repeated in the assessment that species-specific surveys are a barrier to progress. This is not a claim that is new. It's been rehearsed in the press by developers. and the media. I mean, think back Bat Tunnel on HS2, the most recent one, but it seems to be now finding its way into government planning reform. And, let me be clear, species surveys, they identify where protected species are actually present, they inform what measures are required under law, they prevent illegal harm, and they allow mitigation to be proportionate and site-specific. And over and over and over again, as we take clients through the planning process, we're finding that word proportionate is being forgotten over and over again, as the desire to tick boxes and make sure you're not hung out to dry in the public domain becomes commonplace. And yet this document, it hints at alternative approaches, pre-approved survey assumptions, habitat-based assessments, streamlined assessments through environmental outcome reports. But this is not progress. It's a downgrading of professional standards. It suggests that presence-absence data for legally protected species can just be set aside if it gets in the way of a decision. No mention is made of what happens if a planning application proceeds based on wrong assumptions, or if protected species end up being harmed due to a failure to survey. And let's be frank, that happens now. So this is only going to make it worse if this bill goes forwards as it is written. There's no clear accountability, no clarity on enforcement, just a quiet shift in responsibility away from ecologists and towards a centralised, unaccountable, outcomes-based model. The word proportionate appears throughout the impact assessment, often paired with terms like survey effort or evidence requirements. But ultimately, who decides what is proportionate? I mean, without clear ecological baselines, without professional judgment rooted in field data, proportionate becomes a political value judgment, not a scientific one. We've seen this before in nutrient neutrality and habitat assessments. Evidence thresholds are quietly lowered under the guise of proportionality until the entire process just becomes an empty formality. There's no recognition in the impact assessment that some species require disproportionate survey effort due to life cycle timing, cryptic behaviour or specialist habitats, and yet these are often the very species that are most at risk of decline. In fact, when you dive into it, survey is only mentioned twice in the entire impact assessment, so make of that what you will. There's some huge omissions which I'm obviously pouring gasoline on here. Streamlining here doesn't mean better targeting, it's selective blindness in my opinion. Perhaps the most worrying aspect of the impact assessment is its tone. Nowhere really does it acknowledge that ecological input is skilled, evidence-based and legally necessary. Instead, ecologists are implied to be obstacles, delayers, and a reason why the system is slower than it should be. We're not asked how the system could support better, fast ecological assessments. We're not asked how to improve data flow, enable earlier input, or invest in digital ecology tools. We're simply just being written out of the equation. So, I think this is an extraordinary act of professional erasure going on at the moment. The planning and infrastructure bill, it leans heavily on centralised outcomes, national development policies and templated assessments. In practice, this will make it harder, not easier, to apply ecological expertise at local level. Species don't follow national frameworks. They live in specific habitats with specific pressures, and they require specific timely actions. Removing local authority discretion or undermining the requirement for site-specific data, it's not just lazy policy, it's just plain dangerous, really. And the idea that central outcomes or a central outcome model can ensure species protection without robust local data is just a nonsense. One that perhaps suits some developers and certain policymakers, but certainly not the people who are tasked with protecting England's biodiversity. And mark my words, this will bleed out into Wales and Scotland as time goes on. The final sort of insult really in the assessment is the insinuation that species surveys are a luxury that we can build now and worry about mitigation later. And I know I'm reading between the lines here for impact, but ultimately I think we have to because there's such a lack of detail in all of these documents. We have to read between the lines and look at worst case scenarios, because that means that we have to take action now. If we don't take action now and stand up for the status quo, then then we're in big problems moving forwards. And I think there's an awful lot of skill in the private consultancy sector that can be leveraged and utilised to speed up the planning system. Maybe we look at accreditation of ecological consultancies, so that essentially it's the consultancies that are rubber stamping the survey effort and developing the mitigation if required, and that removes the need for the local planning authorities to get tied up in this forever. And I mean, there's such a huge variety of skill within the local planning authorities. Some local planning authorities outsource looking at or validating ecological surveys. Some have limited skill sets in-house. I think I saw a statistic, it might have been in the second to last podcast, around BNG, and how 40% of LPAs are struggling to deal with it. So, this build now and worry about it, mitigation later strategy, essentially, I believe, in practice means that we're going to end up with development occurring in breeding seasons without understanding population baselines, which is what happens with Great Christian Newts now with district level licensing. Planning conditions that are unenforceable or meaningless. There's no data underpinning them, let alone anybody to enforce them. Ecologists are going to be sidelined and more desk-based, which is going to lead to a mass exodus from the sector. Surveys are going to be skipped, and the precautionary principle is basically just being rewritten as an inconvenience. And, this isn't just a professional concern. I believe it's a legal risk as well. We are going to see an awful lot of judicial challenges to LPAs and developers, government bodies. You can just see this coming. The system that's being proposed at the moment is weaker in terms of biodiversity. It's legally unstable, and projects are going to get tied up in judicial appeals forever. And more delays, more cost, and that will be an actual barrier to development. So this is great, Matt, you're ranting, but what should have been in the impact assessment? I believe that they should have acknowledged that there is an ecological risk of removing species-specific assessment. The role of data in upholding the Wildlife and Countryside Act, habitat regulations, NERC duty, etc. The need to modernise ecological data collection without discarding field work. I know we had a guest on a little while ago that's looking at digitising the planning system as it sits at the moment, where, why has that not happened yet? The role of digital systems to support, not replace, professional survey effort. There's so much that could be done, particularly with AI tools and everything that's coming in that space at the moment. Instead, it kind of ducks all of these. It opts for political ideology over evidence, and in doing so, it risks turning the English planning system into a system that talks about outcomes whilst ultimately delivering avoidable damage at scale. The word species, I believe, when I searched the document, it only appears twice in the entire impact assessment. It also skips the economic damage that is going to be done to the ecological consultancy sector in the UK as people are made jobless in droves. And we're already seeing that on the Facebook groups and things where freelancers are, they're leaving and they're moving on because they're reacting before this has moved forwards. It's not progress, it is regression, I believe. So, what now? Well, I mean, if you are listening to this and if you read my LinkedIn article, if you are a fellow ecologist, and I know some listen to me, if you're a planner, if you're a developer, local authority officer, you probably already know what's at stake with this. And, it's not just a professional frustration, it's a dismantling of the system that we ultimately rely on to ensure nature has a legal voice in the planning system. We really do need coordinated professional resistance to this narrative, and there's a lot of people doing good work around this at the moment, writing to MPs, protesting, etc., etc. And this isn't about... Ecologists are very much, from what I have seen, they are putting nature conservation and biodiversity first rather than their jobs and their careers, but let's not be about the bush. There are jobs and careers at risk through this. So, we need to lobby our professional bodies to speak out clearly and urgently and more consistently. Most of them have put out a response, but this needs to be done on a daily basis. And they need to be doing paid advertising and putting real budget behind some of this as well, because ultimately it's going to affect them as well. Local authorities, they need to be demanding funding for proper ecological input internally and externally. Ecologists, we just need to continue applying best practice even when the system tells us to do less. And legal experts, there's going to be plenty of work for them challenging the erosion of survey-led evidence, I feel. And, developers, I guess, really probably need to recognise that short-term speed ultimately will cost long-term viability if environmental credibility collapses. Imagine the news stories when you bulldoze a badger set. The narrative is that this bill would be about building for the future, but the future it's building or seeks to build is one where I believe species disappear quietly without documentation in the name of streamlining, essentially. And if you care at all about evidence-led planning, about the law, about leaving England's natural heritage, and eventually Scotland and Wales will follow stronger than we found it, then I think you need to speak up, because if we don't draw the line here, we may never be asked where it should have been drawn at all. So I'd like you to add your voice to this. If you're an ecologist, are you seeing survey requirements being undermined in practice already? We are. We've had some strange ones come through lately. Have you been asked to work around species data to meet a deadline? Again, that does happen. Do you believe the planning and infrastructure bill is moving us forward or backward? I think I know the answer to that. So please do comment, send me a message. Let's keep the pressure on, and stay safe. And I will speak to you on the next one.